I cannot prepare now.
And he's having some connectivity issues.
Yeah, Irina. Oh,
Luca.
Irina.
Sorry.
Irina, as you're coming back, why the media is so involved in this environmental narrative? What's the reason? Are they gaining something with that?
Well, maybe some journalists, reporters, people who write for the media get some sense of gratification from treating the hottest topic of the age. But I think more than that, the media has to cover something. The media has to write about something. No, it's true. I'm sorry. They have to fill their pages or their websites with content. And there is so much content coming out of the transition crowd that naturally they will cover it. But that's, of course, in addition to initiatives such as the one we discussed last week about climate reporting news and how the agenda needs to be pushed as actively as possible. And that's become one more job for journalists who are not exactly journalists, because they're pushing a narrative rather than reporting facts. And the problem to me is that most people will read the news reports about this legislation in the UK. They won't read the legislation instead. How many pages you said, Tammy?
Like
it was 400.
I don't know.
Who will read 400 pages? Like Tammy said, even the MPs did not read this, probably.
Oh, no, yeah.
Yeah, so, but there's a good side to this, because not all media coverage has been flattering. In fact, some of it has been really enlightening. Basically saying the same thing that Tammy said, summing up the main problems with this legislation. What amazes me is that Brits are not on the streets protesting against it. Have they got used to the idea that their electricity consumption will be remotely controlled and I can't do anything about it? Have they become complacent? And I don't know.
The public doesn't know. I mean, it got a bit of coverage last week in the Daily Mail and the Telegraph and some of the other ones, but it mostly had to do with the potential for bypassing council decisions to stop onshore windmill constructions in areas of natural beauty. And there's a lot. And the Brits have worked tirelessly over the past 100 years to ensure that there isn't building going on top of hills and stuff like that. And so now to have the national government say, well, we're going to consider bypassing whatever the council's rule, and they have the responsibility for it, is problematic. And so that story came out. But the idea that it's not just that they want to install, the government wants to install these smart appliances everywhere and to be able to do load control in citizens' households, is that there's going to be teams of people who are permitted by law to create a dossier on your usage and to investigate and enter your premises without permission to ensure and enforce compliance. Which, if the British public understood that this is what's in that bill, I think they could be out on the street, but they don't know. And it hasn't really been covered too much. It sailed through third reading in Parliament, which means it's now before the House of Lords, which is the last step before royal assent. And so by the time it's implemented, the public will be like, what just happened here? I didn't vote for this. And then it's what I think it is worse. It's like putting a thumb in the eye of the public to say, it doesn't matter who you vote for. They all believe in this net zero transition. And they all agree with this sort of position of invading personal privacy, controlling how much you use for energy and so on. So I don't know what the public will do, because they can express their discontent, but who do they vote for?
Right. And it's all just a precursor to a social credit score system, right? I mean, this is the road we're headed down, is to a China-style social credit score system in which everything you're allowed to do by the government is based on your carbon usage. I mean,
Yeah.
my God, in Canada, what is it, Tammy? They're talking about, they're pushing something called a low carbon diet
Yeah.
for people to
The
adopt.
what?
A low carbon diet.
Low carb, not low carbohydrate, but low carbon. The foods
Very good.
that
Very good.
that are developed with
Mm.
low carbon sources, and you know, and the thing is, the people doing this stuff, pushing these policies, are the religious zealots of our time. So they're not ever going to relent unless they're forced to relent. And when both parties pursue the same agenda, who's going to make them relent? It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's like Tammy said, it doesn't matter who you vote for. Nothing's going to change.
Yeah.
That's a tragedy, actually.
Well, so if I could just tie this into a conversation that happened in India at the end of August, where it was Lynn Forrester de Rothschild, who's one of the owners of The Economist. And she's also in charge of, or had started the Council for Inclusive Capitalism. And in the video, she admitted that, and I'm quoting here, wind and solar won't give people the energy they need or the steel that they need. So here's someone who's been promoting the energy transition for a long time, now actually admitting that wind and solar can't do it. So if it can't do it, as one of the commenters here said, what are you supposed to use? Pixie dust? So you're not allowed to use hydrocarbons. Solar and wind, they say, won't work. You know, these are people who have been championing the energy transition for a long time. They're admitting now it doesn't work. So what are we supposed to use? Right.
One reader on LinkedIn suggested last week we use unicorn farts, which I guess is just another version of pixie dust.
To complement pixie dust, I expect.
Yeah, right.
But I guess the load control point is that we should be using less. And so maybe we'll be allowed to keep nuclear, maybe some natural gas if they have carbon capture, but even so, you must use less of it. And the government will tell you
Right.
how much of it you're permitted to use, perhaps linked to social credit score.
Yeah.
That's interesting because forget households. A reader of my Substack mentioned data centers recently.
Yeah.
Data centers consume huge amounts of electricity. So sure, you can make households shrink their electricity use. How do you make data centers consume less energy? It's impossible. And how do they run on wind and solar? Because they can't.
Yeah, we had data centers in Texas this August that were receiving tax credits from our state government in Texas to halt operations during peak load hours.
Oh my gosh.
Wow.
Luca, one positive note, here in Switzerland, there was a vote against relaxing regulations for faster approvals of solar PV parks. In the Alpine canton of Valais Wallis, 54% said no to easing the rules. Yay, good. Now, will the public officials follow the vote? Because here in the United States, unless the Justice Department is willing to force officials to follow the edicts of voters and courts, the Biden people won't follow them. They just ignore those kinds of decisions. So I guess hopefully Switzerland has a functioning justice system.
But David, we should have a balance between environmental protection, personal freedoms, economic interests.
Of course.
But is it working in this way?
Well, no. I mean, we've obviously gone far past the Rubicon, right? I mean, we're in this area where, again, I mean, as I just said, I mean, to a large extent, the Biden administration is a bunch of scofflaws who are just working in extra legal means now on a lot of this stuff. And as long as our justice system won't make any effort to enforce it, I mean, our courts can issue orders, but they have no law enforcement function in the United States. Court says you got to do something, and if Biden officials decide to just ignore that, well, it's up to the Justice Department, which is run by Joe Biden in the White House, to enforce that, right, on the executive branch of government. And we have a Justice Department right now that simply ignores that duty under the Constitution. And so, I mean, these folks are just free to do whatever they want, essentially. And I suspect that it's like that in some countries in Europe as well. You know, so we're way past any kind of balance in this. I mean, just look at, and I'll shut up, but I mean, look at how the federal government has just tried to ignore all of these dead wells washing up on the beaches of New Jersey and New York, adjacent to all this offshore wind development. 61 wells, and many of these wells are endangered species, okay? They're protected under the the Endangered Species Act. And our federal government just is doing everything they can to ignore that issue for the benefit of the offshore wind industry, because they are religious zealots. I mean, that's what they are. And we need to, our public has to somehow gain that understanding. And of course, our news media won't actually report on that aspect of things. So it's very hard for the average person walking the street to understand that.
If I could just jump in there, David, I think you're absolutely right. And my concern is that a lot of the criticisms that are coming out are saying that our system is broken. It's not the system. We have this amazing setup for how democracy ought to work. But it's supposed to be equal application of the law. We have selective application. And so as long as our politicians, our lawmakers, our policymakers aren't following the system that is good, then it's not the system that needs to be changed. It's the politicians and the policymakers that need to be changed. And how we go about doing that with, within the realms of democracy, I think, is where citizens need to get involved.
Good. There is a comment from a LinkedIn user. We will be allowed to browse only one.
I know that
this will be good for many people, actually.
Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah, it actually
would. The current energies today, the world has this level of civilization because the energy that we used in the past. So can we transform those things in a range of energies?
Well, that's
I think we could, just not the ones that have been selected for all the subsidization. Yeah. I mean, I think there are alternatives. Nuclear, obviously, is a very viable alternative to coal and power generation. But we're not targeting hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies to nuclear. We're targeting wind and solar, which the public officials themselves know and admit in private moments won't work, can't work.
Yeah.
It's simply not possible. But there's plenty of viable alternatives. Even hydrogen, if you can work out the infrastructure issues related to it, can be a viable alternative.
But it's not really an energy source, is it? It's an energy storage, energy carrier.
Right. That's right. That's right. And so,
nuclear is tried and tested for decades. I mean, it works, definitely.
Yep.
See Tom Kirkman comment.
Green totalitarian.
Hey, that's good. I'm going to steal that, Tom. Okay, that'll be in a piece in the Daily Caller soon.
And the control of CO2 emissions, is it something reasonable, or you see that's something forced?
So let me start by saying that we've cleaned up 99% of auto emissions since the mid 1970s in the United States. So there's very little left in terms of real pollution other than carbon dioxide, which is not real pollution. It's plant food, and everybody knows that. And more actual real scientists are gaining the courage to speak up about it as time goes on, which is nice. Wish they hadn't been quiet about all this for the last 20 years. But yes, I mean, if think about this, okay? we got $369 billion in subsidies for wind and solar and all the carbon capture and all this other stuff coming out of the Inflation Reduction Act last year. But how clean do you think our existing energy system could become if the federal government targeted $369 billion of subsidy to the system that already is in place, instead of trying to scrap that system and replace it with stuff they know doesn't work? It's like the international insanity. I mean, it's not just the United States, obviously. Could we get everything? I mean, could we end all emissions from gas-powered vehicles? I bet we could. I bet we could capture all emissions from carbon and coal or coal and natural gas power plants too, if we spent that much money on it. But we're not going to do that because these three industries have
sucking it all up.
captured political class in our country.
And it's not enough.
And it's not enough.
Yeah, that's just the down payment, right?
Yeah. Temi, please, it's for you, this message.
Yeah. It's not really a free market if a government is selecting winners and losers, because the market is supposed to be making those determinations. Every individual action has an effect. And so, yeah, I mean, it's frustrating to see that. And if I could add to what David said there about CO2, I was looking at some stats by the UK regulator, because with carbon capture pipelines, there's concerns about what happens if there's a pipeline rupture. What is the percentage in parts per million that makes it toxic and lethal for people? And it was 15,000 parts per million. And so if toxicity, and that's in a enclosed space, not if it's suddenly released into the atmosphere or something like that. And so, we're worrying about 350 parts per million or 450 parts per million, which, is 0.03% of our atmosphere overall, which is mixed constantly. It's not in an enclosed space. And we're sitting here worrying about something like that when it's actually a significantly higher number that affects people and makes it toxic. And if you think about with the Canadian one, you're not supposed to have carbon food or whatever. Well, does that exclude greenhouse production because they pump the greenhouses filled with CO2 in order to enhance?
These are very, very high in CO2 content, greenhouses. Yeah.
Of course, because it accelerates growth and nutrient development. So is that excluded from the food? I mean, it's ridiculous.
You see, Irina, that the UK is so different country compared to other countries in the world because this initiative that they have.
Well, it depends which country you're comparing it to. Compared to Germany, it's as good as dedicated to the transition. Compared to India, for example, it's totally bonkers. And compared to most African countries as well. I don't know what happened to the Brits, really. They used to be relatively normal 30 years ago. But really, the problem that Tammy mentioned with the two-party system and no real alternative. Yeah, sure, there was the Brexit party, but it was a one-hit wonder. It couldn't be anything more than that. Maybe the Brits and in Germany, we have this alternative for Germany that is gaining popularity as fast as the Greens are losing it. Britain doesn't have that. I don't know why it doesn't have that. Probably because they have been sort of mentally castrated that anything other than Labour and the Conservatives is far right or something. I don't know, but there is a mental problem there. I think to accept everything that is being done to people without questioning. Of course, part of the reason is that, as Tammy said, they don't know what's happening. But that's the case everywhere. People get their news, they get their information about such important things from the media, who report on it selectively, highly selectively.
Then in your case, sorry.
No, it's okay.
No, I mean, Tammy, you live in Canada and the UK. So, what difference do you see between this country in terms of energy approach?
They're both following the mistakes of the European Union. I mean, the whole point of Brexit, for example, was to divorce itself from the ridiculous regulations coming out of Brussels. And unfortunately, the bureaucracy in the UK didn't want to leave. And so they dragged their feet and dragged their feet. And they were supposed to get rid of a lot of the regulations that they had implemented to be in alignment with the EU. And they never got rid of them. So they still have it. And now they're back into this research program called Horizon. And it's, I suspect that if the Conservatives are defeated at the next election, Labour will bring the UK back into the EU, regardless of what the public thinks. I wouldn't be surprised. It wouldn't surprise me at all. But to go on to what Irina had mentioned about the two-party system, there's actually three main parties. And interestingly, Nigel Farage was working on creating an alternative to the Conservative Party when he got debanked. Now, maybe there's a connection there. I don't know what's happening with this new party. My understanding is that they were getting significant support and interest from every constituency in the UK. So
not all is lost. That's good to know.
So not all is lost, but we'll see. Maybe, because he lost his banking, how would a party like that get a bank account to be able to fund the campaign? I don't know.
Well,
which
they
bank
should
in
probably
the UK
sue and make a huge big noise about it. Get even more supporters.
Yeah, I don't know.
David,
That's a promotional.
I just feel better technology that gets ignored because the government-supported technology gets any attention paid.
Yeah, I mean.
Oh, but that's a third comment. His first comment reads, last mile distribution routinely consumes tens of thousands of BTUs per ton mile. This can be reduced to 1,000 BTUs per ton mile. And then the second one says, no politician will provide any support because they're not yet lining their pockets with it. But they will. They'll tax the shite out of it once it gets going. Yes, well, that's all true. Yeah, that's pretty much how our government works.
Luca is coming again. Good, Luca. Thank you for coming.
You know who uses a lot of CO2 to grow the produce? It's the many who have greenhouses to grow pot.
Yeah, but pot is good. It's not toxic at all.
Oh my God.
Helps take the edge off the climate crisis, I'm sure.
It's probably a calming effect on eco-anxiety and related issues.
This despair about environment is something, let's see, easy to understand or forced by who? Who has interest? Only governments, leftist governments? What's the meaning of that despair about environment?
Yeah, that's just overdosing on the transition narrative and climate horror stories because of the amplification they get in the media and young people,
and
especially
our education system,
and the education system, because it's spread now. Young people are really impressionable and they care deeply about everything. So if they constantly keep hearing about a climate catastrophe, a climate breakdown, climate carnage, of course this will affect them because they care about nature, even the genuine ones, not the Gretas. And then, of course, there's such a thing as being in the trend of being fashionable, and climate anxiety is now fashionable. So there's that too. I don't know how much of this climate anxiety is actual mental problem and how much of it is, being in the trend. I guess we'd never know. But there's that too.
Yeah, I think the trend issue is really important. It's like with some of the other things that circulate in the education system, and there's fads. Is it like Pokemon or something? Where
kids get so harmless.
I know. But yeah, I mean, the curriculum in the UK is atrocious for climate alarmism, and it's really unfortunate and sad. And I see it creeping into different types of curriculum in the United States and in Canada as well. And it was there in Germany when we lived there, and so it's it's been building, accelerating, I think, over the past 15 years. So you have an entire generation of kids who went from kindergarten through grade 12 who have heard this narrative over and over and over again, and now they're in the workforce or at university. And what does that do for our future and trying to understand what actually affects the climate versus the political propagandizing about it?
Yeah.
So we already have a generation of indoctrinated brains.
Yeah.
Thanks to this curriculum. Oh, great.
So one of you, please speak to battery storage as it relates to wind and solar. That seems to be the magic bullet that makes these energy forms workable in the minds of wind solar advocates. Thanks. So, yeah, I mean, that is obviously the magic bullet that they always point to. On the Texas grid, we've had 4.8 gigs of storage installed on our grid over the last 3.5 years or so. And on these hot days in August, when we really needed it at peak times during the day to keep the lights on, it was providing about 400 megawatts, so 10% efficiency.
Why?
And I was told by an expert that it's supposed to have a 3-hour cycle time. Okay, so that means it discharges in 3 hours.
Yeah.
And why? That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. But this is
maybe because it was too hot. It couldn't hold the charge.
It was too hot. Well, these are lithium-ion batteries. Okay, yeah. So the technology is lithium-ion, which fails just like wind and solar in extreme weather conditions, extreme heat or extreme cold. Yeah. Lithium-ion just. And so until we have a step change in battery technology, you can install all the capacity you want. It's not going to do you any real good in a weather emergency.
But it will cost a lot of money.
Right. But it's just another myth that's being promoted by the pushers of wind and solar.
Yeah, especially okay, where are you going to put it? What are the materials made of? How expensive is that going to be to construct? What do you do with it when you're finished with it? How do you recycle it? I know that they're working on recycling technology, but it's not there yet. And in any event, as you say, with 4 gigs, how many hours will that actually back up the grid? What happens when you have wind not functioning for a week? Or, if solar,
you have solar, Tammy.
50% of the time.
50% of the time. I bet.
Yeah.
Ever heard of what?
I think the next one. I don't know.
Oh, next one maybe.
Yeah, I've heard of that one. Yeah.
Yes, I wrote about it last week. Yes.
Yeah.
They're too freaked out about the climate and they refuse to have children, even though they really want to. I refuse to buy that.
Which is what? Religious zealotry.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the conclusion could be that the UK is similar to other countries, not
to some.
To some,
yeah.
not all.
No.
Yeah, to the European Union for sure.
Yeah.
But tell me only one point more. You said that the UK can be back to European Union.
Anything's possible. I would not be surprised if the Labour government, if they were elected, would do that. And they're doing it in baby steps, right? So they didn't get rid of all the regulations. They just re-entered the Horizon research program. Maybe there'll be cooperation on other things. Maybe, you can't put anything past what the Remainers really would prefer.
And one last thing that just popped into my head that we haven't mentioned here is that last year, was it just last year or was it year before last, we had the 60-day prime minister, right?
Yeah, Liz Truss.
What's her name?
Elizabeth Truss.
Who was actually going to change a lot of this stuff, right? And what happened to her? What happened to her? She got run out of office by the banks and the corporations and the media. And, my God, it was just unbelievable what happened to her. So, of course,
and replaced with the guy she defeated.
With a guy who's a graduate from the WEF's Young Leaders Program. Rishi Sunak. You know, it's just he's a clone.
Yeah, but she wasn't really a good
up.
prime minister, was she? I mean, she was a
Well,
really
no,
ignorant
but
woman.
she was
She was
going to
naive.
change
I think
things.
naive.
Ignorance was not the reason she was run out of office. Her agenda was the reason she was run out of office.
Nobody would have allowed her to reopen the North Sea, and now Rishi Sunak is
Right.
reopening the North Sea anyway.
Yeah.
So,
but not really.
Yeah, is he?
Because they
never
didn't get
know.
rid of
Really.
they
I mean,
didn't
he's
get rid of
making
the
noises.
windfall tax. They didn't get rid of the windfall tax, and the company said, "Why would we go and invest in these
yeah,
leases
yeah, that's
when
true.
we're not going to be able to make any money from it because the government will take most of it?" So
they'll have to either go all the way and remove the windfall tax, or quit pretending that they are, you know, they care about local hydrocarbon production, and you know.
yeah.
Which
Quit.
hydrocarbon do they have in North Sea?
In the North Sea. The North
Yeah,
Sea.
but not too much. Not too much reserve. The reserve is not big, David, there in North Sea. Was big in the past.
They were big, but yeah, not so much anymore. But of course, the more drilling you do, the more reserves you're going to prove if it's successful. But I don't know how much is left down there.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. Thank you so much. It was a great conversation this Monday.
Thanks.
Thank you. Have a
Thanks.
lovely
Have a
week.
great week.
Have a great week. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.